All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to an episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy. And I have a very special guest today. It is Laura from Fantasy Awash. Hello, how are you
Hello,
today,
I'm
Laura?
good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation
Me
and
too.
getting to know you a little bit and learn about your channel and all of the books that have inspired you to be crazy enough to start a channel and
Right?
be part of this crazy platform, this one
Yeah.
platform. Yeah.
It's a
So
good platform to be a part of. I'm happy to be here.
I think so. This is a really special community, and
Yeah.
I'm very grateful to be part of it myself. It's
Yeah,
just
for sure.
a really wonderful way to meet people with common passions.
Yes.
So.
Yes,
You have the name fantasy in your channel, so that
I
is
do.
obviously a passion of yours.
Yeah. Fantasy
And
is the genre I meet. I want to say I read almost exclusively because it pretty much is. I feel like there's a few books every year that sneak in that aren't fantasy, but for the most part, it's probably 95% fantasy. I'm hooked. So it's
that's
hard for me
great.
to deviate. Yeah.
That's great. I approve thoroughly. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because I do fantasy almost exclusively on this platform, but my day
Right.
job is I do read a lot of other stuff that I just never talk about on YouTube. But yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that I think that's part of why I lean so hard into fantasy now because I used to be in academia. And when I exclusively read historical works and or
Uh,
primary sources. So when I finally wrapped up that part of my life, I was like, well, I'm gonna catch up on everything that I haven't had the opportunity to read for the last decade and have fully immersed myself in fantasy since then, just because there's been so much good quality material that's been put out in the last 10 to 15 years.
oh
And
yeah.
I feel like I missed so much of it. So it's been really nice to reacquaint myself with the genre.
We're in a great age for fantasy, a really
Oh,
great
yeah.
age. I love what's happening in terms of the
Same.
diversity in the genre and just the
Yes.
expansion. And it's just really wonderful to see. But I am very curious about if you don't mind me asking a little bit
Mhm.
about that background. You just mentioned your academic background. I know that you are interested in Roman history. You
I
like our
am.
friend Alan.
Yes.
So do you mind talking about that passion for a little bit? Because I bet it's
No,
not an unrelated to fantasy either.
it's really not. No, it started pretty early on in my life. I always joke with my parents that they should have known I wanted to study ancient things because I remember every springtime the Ten Commandments would come on TV and we would watch it. And I was always so enthralled with Egypt that I thought, this is the greatest thing. How could anyone want to study anything other than this?
Yeah.
And I grew up in Montreal, and the closest program to an Egyptology program near me was a classics major.
Uh,
So I figured for my undergrad, I'll look at doing classics and then maybe for an MA, I'll transition into Near Eastern studies, or if I can find an Egyptology program, that would be great. The closest good quality Egyptology program was the University of Chicago to me, which was a
oh
bit of
wow.
a ways away. So I was
Yeah,
like,
that's some distance.
probably
Yeah.
probably going to stick in classics for now. And when I started my university degree, I already had a very strong love for ancient Rome because everyone, when they're studying Egypt, comes across Antony and Cleopatra. It's kind of the gateway drug, I feel like, for a lot of people. And I became so hyper obsessed with the Roman Empire that I was like, I'm good just studying Rome forever because there is so
Uh,
much intersectionality between ancient Egypt and Rome,
yeah.
especially in the early empire, that it just pulled me in and I never wanted to leave. So I did a double major undergrad with ancient history, specifically classical archaeology.
Oh,
And I
cool.
did another major in religious studies because I wanted to do early Christianity and Judaism because, again, they overlap so much with the early empire. And
Yeah.
then for my master's degree, I ended up doing that in history and classical studies with a focus on Roman religion. So it kind of brought everything
Wow.
together. And I was able to do a section of my thesis on archaeology pertaining to this one goddess that I wrote my thesis about. So it all ended up coming together.
How cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Wow.
loved it.
I'm beginning to understand why you're a Neil Gaiman fan too, I think.
Yes. Yeah, they all kind of merge in this one Venn diagram in my life, and everything kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. And you mentioned religion as well. And I've heard you talk about a couple times, and I can't remember the context, but I distinctly remember you saying you're interested in religion and religious conflict in
Yeah.
fantasy. Do I have that
Yeah.
correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just think it's so interesting because it adds so much to a story, I feel like, because when we look at our actual earth religions, right? So much of it is rooted in ancient magic and the ability to, grant gifts or boons. If you look at Greek mythology, Roman mythology, if you look at ancient Hinduism, like there's just so much of that. And
Yeah.
it has seeped so deeply into our culture that magic and religion are in many ways they weave in and out of each other. So I feel like when you look at fantasy, where especially if you're looking at high magic fantasy books, there's almost always going to be a religion in that story. It's going to be there, and
Yeah.
it's because that's the essence of the magic. So I think it's so fascinating when you compare what we've been exposed to as our real religions as opposed to our fantasy religions, and see kind of how they overlap and how they differentiate from each other.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you and I are definitely in the same boat there. In fact, my trilogy, the Adan trilogy, is about a holy war. Uh,
Yeah.
and religion is at the heart of the magic, which is very much based on actually Eastern philosophy, Buddhism and Hinduism and that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So I'm also fascinated. And the a lot of people have remarked that it feels analogous to the period in let's say Dark Age Europe when a lot of those pagan cultures were being Christianized, that
Yes.
transition. Yeah. So,
Yeah, quite an interesting transition, even just when you look at, there's a really great book. It's called The History of Satan, I believe. Or no,
ah.
I'm lying. It's called, that was the course I took. It's called The Prince of Darkness.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
the book itself takes you through the history of the Christian Satan. And
Yeah.
the Middle
Wow.
Ages period is so interesting because that's really when we see this transitional effect of Satan no longer being Hasatan in Hebrew as the adversarial figure and really taking on this demonic presence.
Yeah.
And just the transition of that happening in that Middle Ages period is so fascinating.
Yeah.
And highly recommend everyone read it. It's a really
Oh,
interesting
cool.
book.
It's fascinating, actually, if you read the Hebrew scriptures, if you read the Christian Gospels, and
Yeah.
there's really not much there. And then
No.
to see how it evolves the figure of Satan, like say, read
Yep.
something like Milton's Paradise Lost.
Yes.
So much of that is not in what Christians refer to as the Bible,
Oh
right? And
yeah,
yeah, it's really
100%.
interesting.
And
Yeah.
that's what's so fascinating about this book because he analyzes the minimal amount of scripture because
Yeah.
there's the introduction of Satan in the early books of the Bible and then in
Book of
Job and
Job,
then
for
yeah,
example. Yeah.
and then he really doesn't reemerge until the Gospels where at this point he's very much an adversarial figure and he's
Yeah.
tempting Jesus in the desert and things like that. So
Yeah.
it's kind of this lapse of time, but there's this dramatic change to this figure
Yeah.
and he looks at it from a very analytical perspective of what was happening to these peoples that were writing these stories down at the time. Is it influenced by their experience and externally what other groups were they coming into contact with that may have had their own versions of a character like this?
Right.
So just if you're open-minded to looking at religion from a historical lens and a non involved religious lens, it is a
Right.
very fascinating read.
Right.
So yeah, I highly recommend
I
it.
imagine that he talks a fair amount about Zoroastrianism in there.
Very much so. The book
Yeah.
pretty much starts with Zoroastrianism, which is such a fascinating religion. I absolutely love it. If people want to look into it, I'm down to talk about it anytime.
Wow, cool. That's really cool. So I can see where your passion for history and religion and all that really does relate well to a lot of fantasy, obviously.
Yeah, they're
Right?
kind of it's a nice marriage in many
Yeah.
ways. it's ended up working out well for me.
Are there particular fantasy series that you feel like, yeah, that's a really good one for how it looks at religion or how it incorporates religion into the story? Because I feel like a lot of
Yeah.
them that I love actually avoid the topic a little bit, like Lord of the Rings, for example.
Yeah.
There's like no actual religion in that world, and
No, there's not. But I mean, the thing that's so interesting is that it is a very heavily religiously
it is
influenced
a
story.
religious text
Yeah,
itself. Yeah,
exactly. So,
yeah,
I mean, the undertones are still there, even though the
yeah.
absence of an actual religion is present in the story. But in terms of modern fantasy, I'm going to say modern in the sense of the last like 35 years being
Uh-huh.
modern, but American Gods is definitely on that list just because Neil Gaiman is a master of incorporating religion into his work.
Yeah.
And doing it in such a seamless way. I feel like that book is so expansive in terms of taking global religions, which I think was done so beautifully. And if you look at another one of his works, the Norse mythology book is an amazing retelling of Norse mythology. But if we're gonna look at the big name, I feel like for right now, I think Sanderson does a pretty good job of
Uh-huh.
religion in the Cosmere because
Yeah.
every Cosmere book, for the most part, whatever planet they're on, is directly related to a religion of sorts.
Yeah.
So I think that that's been really fascinating. I think that the most in depth is probably in the Stormlight Archive,
Hmm.
just because that is really his magnum opus, I feel like. But
For
we're
sure.
starting to see, as the Cosmere is getting further in, as to how all of these different deity like figures are sort of weaving into each other's stories and how they all sort of
Right.
have the same origin point. So that's been really fascinating to observe,
Huh.
especially from a person who himself is very devout. So I always
Right.
find that really fascinating to see someone who themselves is quite religious write different perspectives of their characters and with their journey with religion. Because like
Yeah.
Yasna Colin in the Stormlight Archive is an atheist. And I
Yes.
think she's a very, very well written atheist.
Yeah.
And I just think it's very fascinating when you have that juxtaposition between author and character and
Huh.
how they can do that in their work. So those would probably be the big ones for me right now.
Okay. Yeah. I wonder if there's a correlation at all between an author who is either very devout in their faith or grew up in a context of where they were devout,
Yeah.
and incorporating that in some way into their writing. I
Yeah.
could be way off there, but
I have had this conversation with my husband many times because
uh,
I often bring it up when I come across a religion in a fantasy work. And I am the person that generally doesn't do much research about an author prior to reading their works. If I
uh-huh.
start reading it and I really like it, and then I do my deep dive. And I always look if there is that aspect about them. I'm like, is so and so religious? Just
Mm,
because I think it can really influence their work, or if they have a tumultuous relationship with a faith, or if a personal experience that they've had with faith, that can also influence their work. And I
yeah.
just think it's so fascinating. I read last year, I think it's Ted Chiang, Stories of Your Life. And in that, he has a short story called Hell is the Absence of God. And as I was reading it, I was sitting there and I was really debating with myself. I was like, is this man an atheist or is he ultra religious?
Huh.
And I
Interesting.
couldn't tell based
Huh.
on how he had written it. And I just thought that alone was such a fascinating thing to
Huh.
be left with in the story, because I was like, what motivated this? I was really, really curious in his storytelling. So yeah, I feel like it can be really interesting when you get into the nitty gritty of it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, in some ways, perhaps, ironically, the person who is very certain of their faith and the atheist who's very certain of their convictions are maybe more similar to each other than to the person who's kind of like, I don't
In the middle.
know. Yeah.
Kind
Yeah.
of, yeah. You're strong in one conviction or another.
Yeah. Huh. Fascinating stuff. And I also love watching this, how it plays out in literature. And you have a lot of different examples. You like Tolkien, who
Mhm.
you feel the reverence in his world, even though
Yeah.
there's no explicit organized religion, but there
Yeah.
is a sense of reverence that permeates the Middle Earth. And
Mhm.
it's just makes sense. So his devotion to his faith turns up in that way. Then you have somebody like C.S. Lewis, who in the Narnia Chronicles is
Very prominent.
very prominent, very obvious, really. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not, it doesn't take a lot to see that
Hmm.
he's doing a kind of allegory, really, in
Yes.
Narnia. And that's how his faith, manifests in his fantasy writing.
Yeah.
So
And it's
I'm sure.
interesting because it's really a retelling from the beginning to the end, right? If you look at
Mhm.
the Narnia books, the magician's nephew is really the Genesis story all the way to the last battle, which is Book of
Yeah,
Revelation. And
yeah.
it's so fascinating because you now have authors responding to that text, like Neil Gaiman, who wrote an essay or a short story called The Problem with Susan, based
Uh-huh.
on the C.S. Lewis's take on the last battle. So I mean, it's just so interesting and layered, like there's
Yeah,
so much to it. And yeah,
yeah.
I can go on about it for a really long
Oh yeah,
time.
that's cool. It's very cool. Yeah. Wow, that's really neat. So well, before you became fascinated by all this, of course, you were a reader.
Yes.
When going back quite a ways, I would imagine. So
Yeah.
now it is now time for my standard question for all my guests, which is going on the theory that you are what you read, Laura. What are some of the formative, important reads of your life, going, all the way back to when you were little, to the present? Maybe even talking about some of the ones that inspired you to come on this platform and start a channel.
The very first book I ever remember reading was this lamb story.
Yeah.
It was this like cartoon board book that was like this big, and I remember that there were these sheep in it that were really cute. And I thought to myself as a kid, like, I really like this story, and I don't know what it was that I liked about it. And I remember I knew it by heart, and I tried to pretend to my parents that I knew how to read because like I thought reading was this really magical thing.
It
And
is
I
really.
yeah, and that was my first exposure, I feel, to just being so in love with the story that I wanted it to like be a part of my person. No idea why that was the one that I chose, but I was like 3 or 4, so it wasn't too meaningful to me at the time. But I just don't ever remember a time where books weren't around in my life. My mom is a really big reader, and my dad has never been a big reader, but is a big supporter of stories. So for him, his storytelling was always through film, and my mom was through books. So I felt like I had a really good balance growing up of just having good story exposure. And it then started to sort of overlap a little bit as a kid when I started becoming really interested in history, because my dad would find these really great documentaries for me, and we would sit and we would watch them together, and then my mom and I would read books about it. And it kind of took off from there. And I can't remember the exact name of the book. It might have just been called Cleopatra. But when I was in the 5th grade, I want to say 4th or 5th grade, we had a project where we had to pick a historical figure and do a project on them. And at this point, I was just head over heels in love with all things Egyptology. So I was like, it's got to be somebody from Egypt. And my school library had a book on Cleopatra, and I picked it up and I was like, this is it. Like, I'm done. And I dressed up in a toga, or, like as close to a toga as I could get for Egyptians. I did this whole archaeological project that I brought in and
Wow.
was just so immersed in this world because it just was so magical to me, because it's, you have these monuments that have existed for thousands upon thousands of years
Yeah.
that
Crazy.
just don't make sense. It's like, how are we able to build things that big and intricate that have lasted this long? And that to me was just the most awe-striking thing. And that then just became project after project for me, where I just kept jumping from one historical thing to another. And the next big one became King Arthur the following year, that I did a
Oh,
massive project on that. And I spent my whole Christmas break reading about King Arthur. And like, that really, I think, was the origin point for me, is that it was more historical fiction, but then also these fantastical elements. If you're looking at, you know, Egyptian religion and mummification and the prayers that they're saying. And if you're looking at King Arthur and Merlin and that whole narrative. I mean, there was always this little essence and spark of magic there that I was looking for within these greater historical characters, I felt like.
Yeah, yeah.
And it just exploded from that point. I
Oh, that's
never
so
looked
lovely.
back.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of fantasy too. Like not every
Yeah.
fantasy story does this, obviously, but a lot of fantasy is very backward looking in the sense that there is a palpable presence of the past
Yeah.
in in the present of the story,
Yeah.
where there's this fascination with civilizations that have come and gone. How many
Mhm.
fantasies do you know where there was a previous, more sophisticated civilization
Yeah.
that is now
Gone.
gone, and where did they go? And there are these little
Exactly.
echoes, these remnants of that ancient past,
Yeah.
and there's just sense of layers and history and
Yeah.
so much myth attached to the people of the past. Oh, you have an
I
apple.
apparently was doing a thumbs up with my finger, so I agree. But yeah, I completely agree though. It's so true. And I
Right?
think it's so funny to me whenever people say that they don't relate to fantasy, because I'm like, fantasy is so relatable on so many levels. If you don't even really have to look that hard for it. There's so much of our human existence that is seeped itself into fantasy.
Oh my goodness.
And it's just replicating itself if you allow yourself to accept the fact that maybe non-humans live in this world with humans, or a
Yeah.
whole other species. But yeah, I mean, there's so much connectivity, and I feel like fantasy just offers everything.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. Now, you mentioned your fascination with ancient Egypt and Rome and all that. I have to ask, and I think you're young enough to have read the Rick Riordan books. Were they ever a source of interest for you, or because he does
I have
some
not read
Egypt?
those. I
Okay,
have
wow,
not
okay.
read those.
So
No.
they're
I
directed toward a younger audience,
audience,
but
yeah.
he has I believe a series that's Egyptian. He's got the Greek stuff, Percy Jackson,
Mm,
but there's also a Roman
yeah.
one, and
Ah, yeah.
uh,
I never ended up reading those. And I'm
uh,
gonna I'm gonna come across as really picky sounding here.
uh-oh.
And the problem is not that I didn't want to read that type of stuff at that point. It was that I wanted to read historically
Uh-huh.
accurate
Yeah, yeah,
books.
yeah, yeah.
So because I was really a know-it-all as a kid, and I wanted to disprove all the documentaries and stuff that my parents and I were watching. Like, I wanted to fact check them.
Oh my
So I
goodness, yeah.
really started leaning into actual historical texts and looking at that. And then the historical fiction that I really ended up reading a lot of as a kid, it was this series I think called The Royal Diaries, where each one of them was focused on a historical female royal.
Uh-huh.
And
I think I've
they
heard of
had
those. Yeah.
yeah, they were these really beautiful hardback books, and they were written in a POV in the form of a diary, just as this girl was coming on the brink of her leadership and rulership. And I remember the first one I read, I think, was Elizabeth I. And then there were several others that I ended up reading along the way. And that kind of became my little historical fiction outlet. And then at that point, I was so immersed in Harry Potter for fantasy that I was just
Okay.
I was living a good life at that point.
Sounds lovely. So Harry Potter was a big one when you were young?
Big one, yeah. It still is. I love it to this day so much. I can't wait for my kid to be old enough so I can experience that again through her. I'm just waiting.
That's how I experienced Harry Potter because I was too old
Yeah.
to experience it as a kid. I was close to 30 when the books were published, and my first reading of them was with my older daughter, and I read them again
Mm,
with my younger daughter, and
yeah.
it was fun. I loved experiencing the books with my girls, who also read the Rick Riordan books, by the way. That's the reason I know
Nice.
about those as
That's
well.
awesome though.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, that's how I experienced Harry Potter and it was exciting. We even went at a certain point when my younger daughter wanted to go to what's it called in Florida, the place with
Harry Potter World.
yeah, Harry Potter stuff.
Yeah, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter.
Universal
Yeah.
Studios, Universal
Yeah,
Studios.
I've been. It's so fun.
Oh my goodness, she pestered us for probably 2 or 3 years, and we finally just gave in. She was so persistent, and finally we just said, okay, fine, and we went.
I love
Actually,
that.
just before the pandemic. We literally went in January of 2020.
Wow. I
So,
was there March of 2019, so the year before, but we were headed to Disney World March 2020 and we're in Florida when they closed for COVID.
oh,
So it was
yeah,
really close when I was
yeah.
hoping to do Disney and then drag my husband over to Potter World because he didn't come with me the previous year,
Oh,
but we just missed it.
well, well, hopefully they're doing fine now. But yeah,
I
that was
think they're yeah.
they're probably
I
doing
think they're
really
good.
well. But yeah, no, it was fascinating. And just to get a I did make the mistake of having what's the thing that drink that they're always having at Hogwarts?
Butterbeer.
Butterbeer. So I made the mistake of going to the Leaky Cauldron and having my butterbeer and then going on
Yes.
Hagrid's motorcycle ride,
No.
which you want to reverse the order there.
100%. Yeah. Were you there at the time of year that you could get it hot or cold?
It was January, so I it was it? I don't know if it was hot or cold. I can't remember. I think it was just cold, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's certain times of the year that you can get it one or the other, and that's the best time to go because you can get both and you can decide which one you like more.
Yeah. But it was fun. She got to get her wand in the wand shop, and
Yeah,
that was a lot of fun. And
that's
um,
awesome. I love that.
yeah, yeah. I also discovered that I get extremely sick when I do the not the actual roller coasters, but the virtual rides. Those make
I
me
was so
nauseated.
dizzy after that, the one in Hogwarts.
Yeah.
It took my friend and I about an hour to recover after that. We just ended up sitting there going like, are we getting old or like what's happening here? Because we had a really hard time with it. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a very strange experience.
Yeah. Well, the things we do for our kids,
And ourselves.
and ourselves. But yeah, that's cool. So any other formative reads that we should be focusing on here?
I feel like the next few were American Gods. That was definitely a big one for me. I came across Neil Gaiman initially through film. I saw Stardust in the theater and thought, this is amazing. I loved the film so, so much. I went and I read the book, and it was one of the only times that I've ever felt that I liked the movie better, even though I still really liked the book.
I watched
And
Stardust with my daughter, and I watched Coraline with my daughter as well.
yes, and I think those are the two that Neil says he actually prefers the films to
Oh, is
the
that
books. I
right?
know, yeah, I know he's definitely said that about Stardust. I think he might also feel that way about Coraline. But I then at the time, the man I was seeing at the time, he had read a lot of Neil Gaiman. And I said, I've just read Stardust. And he was like, well, you've got to read American Gods. And I picked it up and read it, I think, in a day and a half. Like I was so
Wow.
engrossed in that
Wow.
story. I just could not put it down. And it was over summer break, which was perfect because it was the one time of the year that I was able to really catch up on fantasy reading. And because at this point I had started my degree, and I was so in love with American Gods, and just I could not stop talking about it to anyone that would listen. Like if I saw someone with a book, I was like, have you heard of this book called American Gods? Like you seem to like books. You should read it.
Well, you and I have talked
And
about it, right? I
yeah,
mean,
exactly. So I was
right?
just so enraptured by that book, and everything about it was everything I could have asked for in a fantasy book, especially a modern fantasy book. It was my first real exposure to urban fantasy, and anything that wasn't Harry Potter or kind of Tolkien or
Hmm.
Narnia-esque. It was really the one that sort of branched me out of my fantasy bubble, and it was a really great one for me to have. It just resonated with me so well. And from that, I then read A Song of Ice and Fire. I read
Oh,
the
cool.
yeah, and jumped into that and was like, well, this is great.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it
I
was
do
like
want to
a
give a quick
complete
shout out
shift.
to that discussion that we had on your channel
Yeah.
on
We had
American
a
Gods.
great chat on American Gods. It was our
Yeah,
first conversation, and it was so wonderful because we got to gush about that book and all its shapes and forms for a
I'm
couple
a
of
fan of too.
hours.
I mean, when I
Yeah.
started my channel, I made a series of videos, basically why such and such is among the best of fantasy, and I
Yes.
included American Gods in that initial series.
Yeah.
It's a text that I've taught, as you know, in my fantasy novels
Yeah.
course. It teaches really well because it's so theme driven,
Yeah.
just beautifully written. It's a story that you can talk about endlessly.
Forever, really. It's just it offers so much, but yeah,
Very
it's such a good
rereadable
book.
too. I've read it probably 5, 6 times.
Yeah,
So
I've read it a few times over. I was saying to my husband after our conversation, I was like, well, now I have to go reread it.
yeah,
Just because I love it so very much. But yeah, that kind of then brought me into my adult fantasy era. I feel like that was
beginning with
my
A Song of Ice and Fire.
yeah, and that was my big jump. And then simultaneously, while I was doing my undergrad at that point, I was picking up the Odyssey, the Iliad,
Oh,
Gilgamesh,
cool.
and the Aeneid. And I had a very heavy course load in that sense, where it was a lot of epic retelling. And then simultaneously in my religious classes, I was reading the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata and was very involved in that part of my brain. Like mythology was going nonstop in that side of my brain. And then simultaneously, when I had breaks over the summer, I would jump back into Song of Ice and Fire or fantasy when I could.
Yeah.
So that kind of then brought me to my apex. I feel like of how we got here.
Oh, it's fantastic. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you go and read? I'm reading The Sandman right now, which is
Yes.
a lot of fun. Is that? I mean, I think like you, I believe you did it in the same order because I read American Gods first, and now I'm going back and reading The Sandman, and I'm seeing a
Yes.
lot of like, oh, I see where this is. There's a
Yeah.
lot of commonality between the texts,
Yes,
really.
there is. I have not read all of Sandman yet. I've read a few volumes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely agree with that. And also it's just if you want to talk about like religious figures and stuff,
Yeah.
Sandman is
Yeah.
is so good because Lucifer and Sandman is also a really interesting take
Yeah.
on it. And I did a video almost a year ago now on death as a character in fantasy.
Oh, cool.
And Death in Sandman is one of my favorites. She's
Same.
she's amazing. I love her.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really, really good.
Yeah, I've loved the episodes of Sandman when death has turned up so
Yeah,
far.
she
Definite
is my
favorite.
favorite of the endless, like without
Yeah,
question. Yeah, she's
so
great.
cool. So what are now we're in the present, I guess, sort of. And what are now some of the series that inspire you, that you love to talk about, that are what where you feel like your passion is at the moment?
So it's been kind of a weird journey for me. I felt like last year was really my year of Sanderson. I took that literally when they called it the year of Sanderson, and I read the whole Cosmere last year except one book. So I was very literal when they said the year of Sanderson. I was like, well, challenge accepted, and jumped into that head first and really fell in love with the Cosmere as a whole. I had a great reading experience with that. I also read Joe Abercrombie for the first time last year and
Ah, great.
fell
I
in
love
love with
Abercrombie.
I
Yeah.
fell in love with First Law. Glokta is probably my favorite character of all time. I love him so
Wow.
dearly. And
Wow.
then this year I had this really weird shift where we started the beginning of our year was really stressful. Like I always tell people this, January and for me for some reason is when traumatic life events happen. Like
Oh,
January is where stuff hits the fan in January.
yeah.
And I was saying to a couple of my best friends, I've known my best friend since I was 5. We've been together for over 30 years. It's been a very long friendship.
Oh.
And was telling her, I was like, I need brain candy to read. Like I can't deal right now with something too intense. And she was like, you gotta read Fourth Wing. She's like,
Oh,
I
wow.
just
Okay.
just read it. And I was like, I can't read it. It's garbage. And she was like, you don't know until you try it. I think you're gonna like it. And I said, fine. I was just in a state of needing something to read that would distract me, that I knew I didn't have to commit a lot of energy to. And lo and behold, I had a great time, and I ended up
Really?
reading. I had a great time.
Wow.
So I read the sequel, and then she was like, well, now you got to read ACOTAR. So I jumped
Oh,
in then and I read all of ACOTAR. And since then, I've just been on this big romantasy kick.
okay.
And it's been a
Okay.
complete first for me, but I'm having a great time with it.
That's
So
what matters.
yeah, so really it's been a fun experience for me over the last, I would say, 18 or so months, because I really motivated myself with starting my channel. I started my channel in January of 2023.
Okay.
And so to go back a little bit, I started my channel because I had a traumatic brain injury a few years ago.
Oh,
And when I had that, I wasn't able to read. So that was an issue for me for about 2 to 2.5 years. I just physically
wow.
couldn't read. And finally, at the end of 2022, it was starting to clear up a little bit. And I was saying to my husband, I was like, I miss reading. Like, I really want to get back into reading, because it's just been such a core part of my person my whole life. I've always identified myself as that nerdy kid who likes books. So the
Yeah.
fact that I didn't have that for a few years, I felt very absent from myself in that way. And
Yeah.
I said, if I make this channel, it's going to hold me accountable to having to read stuff, because I'm going to have to talk about things. And I don't want to just talk about things that I've read in the last 15 years. I want to talk about things that I'm currently reading, and then how I can relate those to things that I have read 15 years ago.
Wow.
And because of that, it just has allowed me to acclimate myself back into reading, into fantasy as a whole, come across all these new authors, but also simultaneously go back to authors that I really love, like Neil Gaiman,
Yeah.
and figure out what it is for me now that I really like as a reader. Because I know what I liked as a reader 15 years ago and 10 years ago, but I didn't know anymore what I liked as a current reader.
Uh-huh.
So I've come to realize that I had these very persnickety opinions about certain subgenres of fantasy, when
Sure.
in reality, I actually quite enjoy them. So I was like, this is just fun now that I can pick up a new genre and say, let's give it a go
Yeah.
and see if it works for me. But they're all still sort of under that fantasy umbrella. It's just finding these new sub genres within that.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
really incredible. And I'm first of all, I'm so glad that you recovered to,
Thanks.
that's must have been really difficult to have I'm sure many things taken from
Yeah.
you for a period, but reading,
Yeah.
as someone who also much of my existence is centered on reading, in my
Yes.
professional life, I'm a professor, I'm an English professor, and I write and I read, and that's kind of my whole life, really. So that's
Yeah.
really something and that's amazing. It's a really beautiful story in the sense that you were able to overcome that
Thank
and
you.
to be where you are now. Congratulations. I mean,
Thanks.
that's wonderful. That's
Yeah.
inspiring, really
Thank
inspiring.
you. I mean, it's one of those things, I feel like, whenever you have an injury, right? If you go to PT or physiotherapy is what it was called where I grew up, they ask you, like, what's your goal when, when you want to heal the injury, like, what's your goal?
Yeah,
And I remember thinking, when I finally got a diagnosis, I was like, I just want to read. Like, I just want to read. And we came across BookTube during the pandemic, because everybody did. And
sure. Mhm.
the first BookTube channel I came across was Bookborn. And
Oh,
it
that's a good
was,
one. Yeah.
yeah, and it was because she was doing the comparing and analysis of the Wheel of Time show to the Wheel of Time books.
Uh-huh.
And I had read about 2/3 of the first Wheel of Time book and never got back to it. It didn't sit well with me when I started reading it.
You
But
mean
my husband,
the eye of the world? Is
the Eye
that?
of the World, yeah. And my husband had read the whole series. So when we
Oh,
watched the first episode of the show, I was like, I wonder if someone is doing a compare and contrast between the two. And we
ah,
came across her channel, and I was like, oh, this is like a thing. People do this on YouTube. It's not just
Yeah.
for music. And that was very eye-opening for me because I assumed that YouTube was strictly for music and food videos. Like that was it. And I didn't realize that there was this whole group of people that really like to talk about books on YouTube. And I was like, well, this is awesome. And we came across that and it just became, we would sit down pretty much every evening and be like, okay, what do we want to listen to? And I mean, I ended up coming across pretty much everyone's channel that way. And
Uh-huh.
it was a really fun experience. And then the further and I got into that, I started talking to Bookborn on a regular basis. And I was like, I think I'm going to give Mistborn a go. Like that's going to be the series that gets me back into reading because all of these channels I were watching were saying, if you've been away from fantasy for the last several years, you've got to check out Mistborn. It's this amazing trilogy, blah, blah,
Uh-huh.
blah. And I was like, okay, I'll give it a go. And I looked to my husband and I was like, okay, for Christmas, get me that. And I'll see how it goes and we'll go from there. And I inhaled that trilogy in, I think, a week.
Wow.
And I was like, I'm doing it. I'm going to talk into this void that was my camera, my cell phone in my basement, which was really dingy at that point. And I said, you know what? Like, if two people watch it, cool. And I can have told two people my thoughts on these series, but
Wow.
this is gonna be it. And it ended up being really, really great. And it was the highlight of my year last year joining BookTube. Like I tell people regularly, I'm like, it was the best thing I did last year.
Wow. I feel
Yeah.
the same way about starting a channel. I was one of the smartest things. And I can't say I was especially smart about doing it, but in retrospect, I was smart to do it because I didn't know about BookTube. I started a
Yeah.
channel basically as a supplement to my fantasy novels course. And I was
Mm.
completely unaware when I got this idea that there were people on this platform talking about books.
Yeah.
I even thought to myself, maybe there's no one else out there who's talking about fantasy on YouTube.
Exactly, right? You think like you're having this novel idea, and then
Yeah.
lo and behold, there's thousands of other people.
So yeah, I was quickly disabused of my hubris and realized, oh wow, there's a whole bunch of people doing this.
Yeah,
How cool is that? And then some of them reach out to me. It was really so nice. Some of them are still around. Some of them stopped doing their channels,
yeah,
but in that's that it evolves. Everything people have lives, and
it
uh,
does. It's been really interesting just to see how each year kind of produces a class of
yeah,
people. And
yeah,
I felt very privileged to be part of the 2023 class. It was a really
a good
good group of
class.
people. Good
Yeah,
group of people,
yeah.
honestly. And I've made some really great friends through there. Like, I'll be talking to my mom, and she's like, "Who have you talked to this week?" And I'm like, "They're all from BookTube."
Yeah.
And it's I live in a rural area that I moved to during COVID. So for me, it's been a really great outlet in terms of getting to know people and just communicating with people. So I've loved it for that. And it has introduced me really to most of the new series and authors that I've read. I did this thing last year where I opted not to read the back of the cover for any book that I read.
Oh wow,
I went
wow.
in blind to every single read. I picked up Mistborn and I knew a little bit about it, but really nothing much. And I was like, okay. And then everything else I went in blind. And I was like, I found out about these books through BookTube. I saw people's thumbnails and I was like, I'll try that. And it ended up working out really well for me. I had a great reading year. I know that's not an approach for everybody, but yeah, it was really fun.
That's awesome. By the way, Mistborn, I have to say, so this is my 54th episode of Dear Doctor Fantasy.
Congratulations. That's a good
Thank you.
number.
Yeah, and it's been fun. But I've sworn to myself I'm going to do at least 300 of these. So let's see.
Okay.
But uh, it's fascinating because I will have to tell you that more than any other series. Now, for people my generation, it would be Lord of the Rings, no
Sure.
doubt. But for many people, it's not the one that they fell in love with as kids. Okay,
Yes.
that's usually Harry Potter or something like
Yes.
that. But the series that got so many people back into reading after
Mistborn.
dropping reading for a period, usually
Yep.
high school, college, or whatever, they'd stop reading for pleasure. And then suddenly they come across a story, a book that just ignites something, and they go
Hmm.
back into it wholeheartedly. And
Yeah.
I have to say, Mistborn is the most common one,
Yep.
actually, that I hear.
It's
Um,
100%. And I would say, in terms of people that I've spoken to on BookTube, it's probably 90% Mistborn. And
wow.
then people I have seen in the general walking around the world, it's Akatar. So it's
Oh,
been
ah,
really interesting seeing it from these two perspectives where so
wow.
many women have told me they're like, Akatar got me back into reading. And then on BookTube, I see everyone saying,
Mistborn.
Mistborn is the series that got me back into reading. I'm like, cool. I'm glad something did it. And I mean, Mistborn is a really interesting series in that it walks a very fine line, I feel like, between YA and new adult. And then in some cases, it's very adult. So
Yeah.
it was, I remember when I was reading it, I was like, I don't know where to place this in my brain because that's something I've learned for myself as a reader. I do struggle if I can't categorize a book very
Uh-huh.
well. If it's too genre-y and that it's pulling from too many different genres, I get very overwhelmed and I'm like, what is this supposed to be? And I focus more on that than I do the actual story. And when I
Uh-huh.
was reading Mistborn, I remember I messaged Bookborn and I was like, okay, but is this YA or is it not YA? Like, I don't know where to put it in my
It's
brain.
interesting because I do think of Sanderson as a very talented YA author,
Mm,
and I think he's YA in his tone. Now, keep in
yeah.
mind, I've only read Mistborn and the first three Stormlight Archive books.
Okay.
So I'm just saying this with my very limited. I mean, that's I've actually read the last three books in Wheel of Time as well. So I've read
Okay.
9 books that he's written. Okay,
Yeah.
and I do feel like he's more. I'm saying YA is a very broad category here
Sure.
in his tone and in his accessibility, which is wonderful.
Yes.
That is why he has brought so many people into the genre because I
Yeah.
think his stories are very accessible,
They
and
are.
I am thankful for somebody like him who does that. I think it's
Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah.
His prose are very simplistic, but like you said, I've seen so many people who are ESL and they
Uh-huh.
say, this is who really got me into reading in English because his prose are approachable. And I think that's wonderful, and it's nice too, sometimes I feel like, to pick up a fantasy book where you're not inundated with very heavy language, because sometimes you can pick up a Tolkien-esque book and be like, that's a lot of words, and,
Yeah.
and think we could pull back a little bit on that. And I feel like Sanderson does that, but he's
Sure.
not for everybody. But I do appreciate the fact that he is very
And
approachable to
he's
me.
very upfront about the way he tries to write like that. He
Yeah,
calls it, I believe he says, calls it transparent prose or something
I
like.
think that's, yeah, a good way of putting it.
He doesn't want to call attention to the prose. He wants someone to just feel immersed in the story, and
Yes.
that's his approach to writing. And you know
Hmm.
what? I think he's very savvy in that. He's doing it by
Oh yeah.
design. That's great. I sometimes like to read that sort of thing myself.
Yeah.
Other times I'm really in the mood for something more rich, more challenging in terms of
Sure.
the prose. And
Yeah.
that's great. I think it's great that we have all that available to us. So,
Yeah. I had a really interesting experience last year because for Christmas the previous year, I had, before I joined BookTube, I joined a fantasy Facebook group and I put out a PSA and I said, I'm trying to find some books for my husband for Christmas because he also reads fantasy and loves
uh,
fantasy and sci-fi. So I was like, this is what he has read and loved, and this is what he has read and not loved. So what has come out in the last several years that I could gift him that we think would fall under this love category? And the number one response I got was The Lions of Alrasan by Guy Gavriel Kay.
oh, yeah, great.
And I was like, done. So, and then pretty much people were saying just anything by Guy Gavriel. Okay. So I looked it up and I read the description for Lions and I was like, I think he probably would really like this. So I got that for him in addition to 5 or so other books. And he says it's his second favorite book of all time. He
Wow,
absolutely loved Lions. And
good
last
call.
year, yeah, it ended up being really, really good. And then last year, Joanna from Joanna Reads was like,
Yeah.
I'm going to read this. do you want to buddy read it? And I was like, yes, because Josh has been pestering me now for about 6 months that I really need to read this book because he really, really loved it. And I had just read, or no, I read Lions and loved it. I thought it was a phenomenal read. And then jumped into Yumi and the Nightmare Painter because the secret project had like just arrived and
By
I got it.
Sanderson. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
just Sanderson. And I remember talking to a friend about it and being, this is awful for Yumi. I was like, why is this so bad? And he's like, you cannot read Guy Gabriel Kay's prose and then jump into Sanderson's prose and think that it's going to be the same thing. And I was like, that's
Right.
very true. And you kind of have to remind yourself with certain authors that it's not necessarily that they hold themselves to a different standard of writing. It's just that their writing is different. And I
Yeah.
had forgotten that with Sanderson when I jumped back in, and it took me a minute and I was like, oh yeah, here we go. And then as soon as I readjusted my expectations, I enjoyed the book much more. But I agree. Sometimes you just want that different connection to the writing and attention that's being put into it, as opposed to something that's a bit more basic.
And I think Sanderson is well aware. He is actually, I think it's Guy Gabriel Kay that is, he's cited as his favorite author
Yeah,
or one of his
it
favorite
is.
authors.
Yeah,
He
one of his favorites. Yeah.
admires him deeply, and he knows what he's doing. He knows
Yeah.
exactly what
I
he's
think he's
doing.
doing pretty well.
I think he's sold more
Yeah.
books than Guy Gabriel Kay. I can promise you that.
Yes, significantly, especially with that Kickstarter. Oh man, unstoppable.
Yep, yep. So yeah, I think that he should be celebrated. And hey, the guy has also recently done a really heroic thing for people like me, little
Mhm.
authors like me, in terms of helping to persuade Audible to
Audible.
give a
Yeah.
fairer deal to authors. So good for him. He's using his
Yeah,
influence in great ways, in my opinion.
I agree.
And I love the more complex prose. I'll be reading some more Guy Gabriel Kay later this year myself. So I've only
Yeah.
read Tigana, and that was a long time ago. So
Okay. I'm reading Tigana in April, so next month.
oh, cool. You beat
Yeah,
me
that's
to it
coming up.
then. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I ended up also then reading this A Song for Arban last year with
uh-huh.
Joanna as well,
Yep.
which got right here. But I really liked it. Joanna loved it.
I know. I
Yeah,
know.
she
Yeah.
she loved that book. So yeah, it ended up working well for most of the people in our group.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I might go back to the Fionavar tapestry, I think is his earliest
Okay.
stuff, I believe. So I might, after rereading Tigana, I think I might go back to that, but we'll see. I'll figure out that reading order when I get to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So many things to get to. What are you excited about reading in the future? What series you have sort of looking at on the
Yeah.
horizon that you're thinking, I think I need to check this out.
So I had planned originally for this year that I was going to start Robin Hobb and I
Ooh,
was going to start Malazan. I have not
okay.
yet done either of those
The
things
two
because
big
I've
ones. Yeah.
two big ones because apparently I only read romantasy now, but I
Uh-oh.
do want to get back to those. I I'm very much a binger is what I've come to realize. Like I like complete series, and if it's something
Uh-huh.
that's easily digestible, I pretty much just inhale the whole thing and then I move on to the next series.
Yeah.
And I've noticed it's more so a thing since my brain injury because my memory is good, but it's not as good as it used to be. So
Uh-huh.
I find it more helpful for me to be able to jump immediately into the next book so I'm retaining as much information as I possibly can.
That makes sense.
So
Yeah.
I'm hoping to get to those soon. I have I've had a lot of anxiety about starting Robin Hobb
Oh.
simply due to the fact that I'm a very big animal lover, like a
Oh.
very big animal lover, and I
Uh-huh.
know that there is stuff in these books pertaining to
Yeah.
animals that is going to make me upset. So I'm trying to go into
Yeah.
it optimistically, and my husband has told me, he's like, I think you'll be fine, but it's one of those things for me that I get overly emotional with
Yeah.
anything animal related. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that while I was reading um Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings series, finishing up, starting in I guess it would have been late in 2022. I started to say, yeah, I was along with Mike from Mike's book reviews. Had resolved to finish reading The Realm of the Elderlings, and early in that process, my dog passed away, which was devastating. I was very close
Yeah, that's
to
horrible.
Belladonna, who, by the way, was named after Bilbo's mother, Belladonna Took.
Amazing. That's
He was
amazing.
just a real sweetheart, and it hit me really hard, that loss. But I will tell you that reading Hob was almost like it was
Therapeutic.
the perfect thing. Yeah,
Okay.
it was
Interesting.
therapeutic for me.
Okay.
That now I had this was the series that I was reading at the time was the Tawny Man. So
Okay.
I
Everyone
already
loves
had
that
read.
series.
Sorry.
Everyone loves that series. Like
Oh,
I
it's
have,
my favorite of
yeah,
the entire Realm of the Elderlings,
yeah,
followed closely by Fitz and the Fool, which is the last trilogy.
yeah.
But yeah, it's brilliant. It's just beautiful, so emotionally rich. I don't think any other author has. Stephen Erickson is close, and John Gwynne probably is third, but and he does a lot of animal companion stuff too. John Gwynne does,
Yeah.
but Robin Hobb has probably made me cry more than any other author, and a lot of it was during the Tawny Man trilogy.
Yeah.
But it was I found it so helpful and so
That's
wonderful.
amazing.
Yeah,
I
to be
I
reading
that
that.
makes me feel quite a bit better
Yeah.
because we don't have dogs. We're a cat family,
Uh-huh.
but in the course of the last 2.5 years, I lost my original companion and my husband just had his pass away in December. And it's been a lot of big loss in
Yeah.
what feels like a condensed period of time because during COVID we were all stuck at home with each
Yeah.
other and you really couldn't escape it. And I just don't do well with animal stuff. I can't explain it. Like even with things that I know are coming. If anyone has read A Song of Ice and Fire, I did not thrive while reading those books. And I
Yeah.
especially did not thrive while watching the show. I had a really difficult time with certain scenes in the show. And I know firsthand, I don't know if you've read Fire and Blood, his Targaryen history book.
I have.
There,
Yeah.
yeah, there is a scene in that book, Philip, that I had to stop my car because I was very upset. And I even knew it was coming. And even still, I was very upset.
Oh, you were
And
listening. You were listening
I
to it.
was listening, yeah.
Okay.
And when when the show premiered House of the Dragon, I said to my husband, because my channel originally was a podcast with my husband. It was called
Oh,
Fantasy Awash with Laura and
okay.
Josh.
Gotcha.
And I just dropped with Laura and Josh and I kept Fantasy Awash. And originally it was just us doing book to show analysis and discussion.
Uh-huh.
And at that point, we had a newborn, and he was like, I don't have energy for this. And I was a stay-at-home mom at the time, was like, I need some kind of creative outlet. So I'm going to keep doing this by myself and it's going to shift completely to books.
Uh-huh.
And the final episode of House of the Dragon season 1, I knew what was coming and paced around our house for 2 hours
Oh
after the
no.
episode aired because I just could not calm down. I don't know why my camera's giving me a thumbs up right now. This is not a thumbs up moment.
No, it's
But
not.
no. So I have a really weird thing with animal death. And even if like I can watch a battle scene totally unfazed, does not bother me at all, can read about it, and I'm totally fine. This is why Sandan Glokta is my favorite character. The second an animal shows up, I'm like, well, I have to rethink everything now. So yeah, I've been cautiously optimistic about starting Robin Hobb just because everyone speaks so highly of her and her prose and her character work. And I transitioned, I feel like, in my brain last year when I read Abercrombie for the first time to being a very character driven reader. And
Uh-huh.
everyone then kept following it up and saying, if you like how
Bob.
Abercrombie writes characters, then you have to read Hobb. And I was like, okay, well, I will. And then I was all excited to start reading her. And then everyone started saying these books were super traumatic. So I was thinking maybe we'll pause that for just a little bit.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking probably by June, I'll start and see
Well, the
how
big
it lands.
difference for me, there are many differences, but one big difference for me between Abercrombie and Hobb, and I would never think of to put them, except that they both write fantasy and they're both brilliant in their own ways. But
Yeah.
Abercrombie makes me laugh, and Hobb makes
Oh,
me
he's
cry.
so funny.
So yeah,
Okay, that's fair. Abercrombie is one of two or three authors that has actually made me laugh hysterically out loud.
yeah.
He's such a skilled author with that. It's brilliant.
Yep, yep. Same here. He's my favorite in terms of comedy and fantasy, no doubt about it.
Is
And
Glocta
that
your favorite of the First Law
Galacta
trilogy?
of the
Yeah,
characters,
sure.
I probably, if I'm going to be totally honest, and it's not a very original answer, but I'm going to be
Logan.
honest, Logan. Yeah. I,
That's fine. My husband is Giselle, so
oh, really? Now
loves
that's
Giselle.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, and he loved him from the first book, like from the get-go, which
Even
was
in the first book. Okay.
even in the first book. So Josh's favorite character from A Song of Ice and Fire is Theon. So
Oh,
he just sides with weird characters, I feel like. And I
yeah.
remember when I got him, because First Law, The Blade itself, was one of the books I got him for that Christmas gift. And everyone in that group that was saying it, they're like, he's going to love Glocta. And I was like, I don't know who this Glocta guy is, but sure. And when I gave him the book, I was like, I'm curious when you finish this book, who your favorite character is going to be, because I've been told by 60 people it's going to be this one guy. And when he finished it, he's like, it's not going to give you any spoilers by telling you who my favorite character was by reading it, but it's this guy named Giselle. And I was like, okay, that's not Glocta, but okay. And then I
Wow.
picked up the book and I was like, are you for real? Giselle? Like this is your favorite character? And he quickly then read the remainder of the trilogy. And I subsequently followed suit because I loved the Blade itself so much. But I was hook, line, and sinker in love with Glocta from the second he showed up on the page and was struggling to walk up the stairs. I was like, it's done. It's done. I'm so here for this character. But I really did like Giselle's character arc throughout the trilogy as a whole, but not
Yeah.
my favorite.
Yeah. If I'm talking about the entirety of First Law, I could say maybe Shivers also has
Oh, Shivers is great.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's close for me as well to Logan. Yeah.
I haven't read all three of the standalones yet.
Oh,
I
okay.
have done Best Served Cold, The Heroes. The Heroes is possibly my favorite of the books that I've
It
read so
is
far.
my
I
favorite
ended up
standalone. Yeah.
loving The Heroes. It was such a great read. And I am about 20% into Red Country, but I love Bremer Dan Gorst as well because he
Oh,
had so
yeah.
many Glockta-esque moments. So
So
yeah,
wait, you haven't yet read Age of Madness then?
I haven't. So that's what I was also going to say. I'm very excited to read Age of Madness.
Hey, yeah,
Yeah.
no, that to me, Age of Madness is Abercrombie's very best.
That's what
Like,
everyone says. So I'm really excited. And
wow.
I'm very excited to see because the one thing that I felt he really lacked with in First Law was how he wrote female characters.
Yeah,
I felt
and
like
he,
Artie was fine. Artie was what Artie was meant to be. But
right.
Pharaoh was very disappointing when you saw what he was able to do with male character studies. And I was like, Pharaoh could have been a lot better. Artie in many ways could have been a lot better, but I was fine with it. And then when I got to Best Served Cold, I was like, Monza is still flat. Like, I don't know what's going on here, Abercrombie. Like, get it together. And everyone kept saying, they're like, just wait till you get to Age of Madness because the women
Correct.
really shine.
This is
So
correct.
I
Yeah.
am looking forward to it from that perspective, just to see how he has matured or changed as an author. So I'm ready for that too.
Yeah, there's that, and there are two very prominent, excellent female characters. And he even does more with some of the older female characters. I won't say which because I don't want to spoil
Yeah.
anything, but
I'm just hoping I get some Glocta snippets in there. Like that's really what my heart's desire is, even though I can go back and read his trilogy because it's really, in my opinion, Glocta's trilogy. But
no,
yeah, it'll be good.
I don't think you'll be disappointed. I don't want to spoil anything, but
Yeah.
the focus is on the new generation more than the
Yeah.
old generation, and
Mhm.
that makes sense in many
Yeah.
ways. But I actually think you might enjoy it from that particular angle as
Sure.
well.
Yeah, I think I will, honestly. Like I've liked aspects of the 5 books that I've read so far. Of the 5 that I've read, Best Served Cold was my least favorite.
Uh-huh.
But it was interesting because I was watching a conversation with Leanna and Bookborn, and there was someone else in there, and I'm sorry because I can't remember the third person. But Leanna was saying that it really changes your perspective if you look at Best Served Cold as not being Monza's story, but Shiver's story. And I thought,
Uh-huh.
oh, that's a really interesting take, especially when you then look at the standalones as a collective. I was like, oh, interesting. So that kind of made me a bit more invested in that story. And also, his books are books that I refuse to physically read. I will only listen to the audiobooks because
Oh,
Stephen Pacey does
uh,
such a phenomenal job for those
I've
books.
heard that.
I I started reading them in physical format and then switched over to the audiobook and was so upset that I had not listened to all of them in audiobook format because the way that Stephen Pacey does Glocta's voice is everything I could have imagined and so much better. It was so much better than what I had in my head. And he really sounded like a graphic audio where it felt like
Wow.
15 people were putting on a production, but it's just this one man. So
Wow.
highly recommend people listen to anything with Stephen Pacey, especially
Cool.
Joe Abercrombie's works.
The other thing that Abercrombie improves on, in my opinion, in Age of Madness is his incorporation of theme, which
Mm,
it's not that it's absent from the original trilogy and the
sure.
standalones, but you can see he's actually really much more deliberately weaving theme into it. It's very
Okay.
very Dickensian in terms of the theme work. Um,
Okay.
so
Well, that's exciting.
yeah, there's a lot of class stuff in there, and it's not
Mm.
just class stuff, but that's the main focus.
I think that makes sense if you look at from how things sort of were in the first trilogy, that would just continue to build into Age of Madness. But yeah, what are you looking forward to reading?
Oh gosh, so many things. Right now, I am reading through the SPFBO
Yes.
finalists,
Yeah.
and I'm getting close to halfway through the finalists now. And I
It's a
am
big job.
by the time this comes out, I might be more like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through, probably. But yeah, it's good. I'm enjoying that a lot. I'm really
Yeah.
grateful to be a judge there. And I'm reading through Jenny Wirtz's Wars of Light and Shadows.
Mm,
Brilliant, just top tier
yeah.
fantasy, in my opinion. It belongs in the conversation with the greatest of the series in the genre.
I've
Uh,
heard really great things about Janie Wirtz, so I have
yeah,
to give her
I
a
mean,
go.
she herself is a force of nature too, but the series is incredible. It's not her only thing, obviously. She has
Sure.
the Empire trilogy that she co-wrote with Raymond Weiss, and she's got other series as well, and some great standalone and To Ride Hell's Chasm, and just a great oeuvre of
Yeah.
fantastic books. So
That's
yeah,
awesome.
I'm reading that, and I'll be starting a few series. I have to finish R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse series. I read the first
Mhm.
trilogy, and then we're gonna read the rest of the books with Joanna,
Yeah.
and then I'm going to read later with Joanna Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu.
I'm wanting to start that. I have the first book, but I
Cool.
haven't
Yeah.
I haven't read it yet. So.
Yep. I just actually the first book just arrived for me. So yeah.
Did you get the
But,
black cover or the floral cover?
I got the boring one.
I have the boring one too. Which I didn't realize there were these really nice ones after I bought it. I was like, well, that's a bummer.
Whatever. I usually just get what's cheaper, honestly.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. So yeah, that, and I am gonna start Ryan Cahill's Bound in the Broken series.
I really want to read that. Yeah, I started looking into that at the end of last year, and I was like, this is up there.
I'm starting that in May. And yeah, a bunch of other things I'm probably forgetting at the moment, but yeah, that's what's coming to my mind. And so yeah.
Well, you've got good reading coming up. It sounds like too.
Oh yeah. That's the thing. The really wonderful problem that we all have is that we're never going to be able to read all the books that we want to read. So
No, no. My husband and I are planning on doing a reread of A Song of Ice and Fire as well. Like that's
cool.
our next big thing. We're gonna
Yeah,
do that collectively, which is gonna be really fun.
cool.
So yeah, I mean, it's fun too when you find things you want to reread, right? But you also at least I simultaneously feel guilt as well because there's so many new things I want to go read, and I'm like, but it's nice to lean into some old favorites as well.
Oh, for sure. I have been doing less rereading, honestly, since I started a channel, but
Yeah, it's hard when you want to just keep up with not only new major releases, but if you're reading a lot of independent authors and SPFBO, like that's a big task.
yep, yep. I used to reread Lord of the Rings every year, but it's been several years since I read it. But
We watch Lord of the Rings every year.
uh-huh.
That's our big thing. So if you're a massive Lord of the Rings fan, how do you feel about Tom Bombadil not being in
Well,
the films? Are you good, or were you sad that Tom Bombadil was not there?
no, I think it makes sense. The Peter Jackson's decision, it's almost a no-brainer, honestly, not to have
Yeah,
Tom Bombadil in the film, because I'm not one of these fans who insists that the adaptation has to be beat for beat the same thing as the
sure.
story, because why would that doesn't work? It just doesn't work.
No,
So
no, it doesn't.
Bombadil's absence is one of the actually it's a no-brainer, really, I think.
I agree.
Yeah. So I like Tom Bombadil. I'm not a Bombadil hater or anything like that, but I
I don't like him.
oh no. Well,
No,
that's
it's
okay.
I remember the first time I read it and I thought, who is this guy? Like, why is he singing so much? Just stop him. It was just way too much for me. But
Okay.
I for me, the story really picks up once you're past Bombadil. Like that's when the
Uh-huh.
story really gets going. But I know people love him, and I'm so happy for people to love him. I just don't. So it's just one of those characters that it's not gonna be for everybody, and that's okay.
Yes, this is true. I think that is actually a fair statement. I love Tom Bombadil. I love what he represents. I love, his personality and his
He has a
quirkiness.
big personality, that is for sure.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm fine with people who aren't Bombadil fans. So we'll still be friends.
We can. Yeah, that's fine. Is would you say, do you have a preferred book in the whole Tolkien universe that you really love? Do you reread things like the Silmarillion as well
Oh
to
yeah.
Lord of the Rings? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know how many times I've read The Silmarillion, The Hobbit, Lord of the
Hmm.
Rings. And I've read the other stuff, most of it just once. But those three things I've reread many times, and Lord of the Rings is my favorite
Do you
because,
have a specific book that is your favorite, or the whole thing collectively? You
well, I
can't.
think of it as one book.
It is one book, so I
Um,
mean, yeah, it's hard.
No, but what I love about it is it is the perfect combination of what Tolkien does in the Silmarillion and what he does in the Hobbit. Meaning, in the Silmarillion, you have this mythology, you have this high tragedy, you have this
Yes.
beauty, this loss. It's epic, it's larger than life. In The Hobbit, you have this very earthy, very childlike,
Yeah.
very whimsical, funny, just and it has sorrow too, it has
Yeah.
loss, but on a different level, on a different
Hmm.
scale. And what he does in Lord of the Rings is he guides both those things. He brings
Yeah,
them
it's a
together.
marriage of the
You
two.
have the humanity of the hobbits
Yeah.
amidst the vastness of the lore of this world, and that
Hmm.
is just, for me, that's the sweet spot with Tolkien.
Oh yeah, his lore is really really quite detailed, and you don't really realize it until you read things like Silmarillion. You're like, oh, okay, there was a lot of stuff
Yeah, and that's
building
really the tip
to
of the
this.
iceberg. Really, it's just
Yeah,
Silmarillion. Yeah,
exactly. So it is one of those fascinating things to get back to our early conversation of
exactly.
religion and fantasy. Like it always kind of comes back. Like mythos in general in a story, it's all linked to religion, and it's just so
So true.
fascinating.
So true.
Yeah.
Well, now that we've come full circle, perhaps this would be a good point for us to finish. I have had a wonderful time, though, Laura. I really appreciate you giving me
Thanks.
some time here. And I encourage everyone to check out Fantasy Awash. There will be a link
Thanks.
to Laura's lovely channel in the description. and go and give her your support and say hello over there. So thank you so much, Laura. And I look forward to our future conversations here on this platform, sharing our love for these stories. And thank you, everybody, in all my wonderful viewers. So love to hear from you guys in the comments. And everybody, until next time.